December 23rd, 1944. 0400 hours. Bastogne, Belgium. The temperature had dropped to minus 12 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze diesel fuel in tank engines and turn hydraulic fluid to sludge. In the pre-dawn darkness surrounding the besieged town, Technical Sergeant James McKinley of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion faced an impossible situation. 12 M18 Hellcat tank destroyers sat motionless in the snow, their right radial engines refusing to start. German armor was massing just 3 kilometers away for what intelligence suggested would be a decisive assault at dawn. Without those tank destroyers, the northern perimeter would collapse, Bastogne would fall, and the entire Allied position in the Ardennes would crumble. McKinley, a 22-year-old farm boy from rural Iowa who had never seen a combustion engine until he was 16, stood in the frozen darkness with a toolbox and a problem that conventional military doctrine said was unsolvable. The official Army Technical Manual stated clearly, Wright R975 engines require specialized depot-level maintenance. Field repairs in sub-zero temperatures are not authorized. But Private First Class Danny Sullivan, a skinny 19-year-old mechanic from Nebraska who had grown up keeping his father's ancient John Deere tractor running through brutal winters, was about to prove that manual wrong. What he did in the next 90 minutes would not just save 12 tank destroyers, it would demonstrate a uniquely American advantage that German forces never understood and could never replicate: the ingenuity of farm boys who had spent their childhoods making broken machinery work with whatever they had on hand. The crisis had begun 36 hours earlier. On December 21st, as German forces tightened their siege around Bastogne, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had displaced to new defensive positions in darkness and falling snow. The move was executed flawlessly, all 12 M18s reaching their assigned sectors by 0200 hours. Then the temperature dropped. By dawn on December 22nd, none of the right radial engines would start. Standard cold weather starting procedures, preheating with gasoline-fired heaters, failed completely. The engines would turn over sluggishly for a few rotations, then stop. Batteries, already weakened by the extreme cold, died after 3 or 4 attempts. Technical Sergeant McKinley, the battalion's senior maintenance NCO, faced a nightmare scenario. Under normal circumstances, engines refusing to start in extreme cold would be transported to rear area maintenance depots. But Bastogne was surrounded. There were no rear areas. There was no depot. There were no replacement engines. And in less than 48 hours, German armor would attack. McKinley had 12 highly trained tank destroyer crews, 12 perfectly functional 76mm guns, and 12 expensive, sophisticated fighting vehicles that were nothing more than immobile steel boxes. According to every regulation, every technical manual, every standard operating procedure, those vehicles were deadlined mission incapable, combat ineffective. That's when Private First Class Danny Sullivan asked a question that seemed absurd. Sergeant, back home in Nebraska, when our tractor wouldn't start in winter, we used to pour hot water on the engine block. Think that might work? McKinley's first instinct was to dismiss this as farm boy ignorance. Wright R975 engines were precision aircraft power plants, not tractor motors. They contained aluminum alloy components, tight tolerances, sophisticated ignition systems. Pouring water on them violated every principle of aircraft engine maintenance. But McKinley was desperate, and he remembered something about Danny Sullivan. This kid had kept the battalion's vehicles running through situations that had stumped mechanics with twice his experience. Sullivan had an instinctive understanding of how machinery worked that transcended formal training. He thought like an engineer, even though he had never finished high school. "All right, Sullivan," McKinley said. "Show me what you're thinking." What Sullivan proposed was mechanically sound, but procedurally heretical. He would heat water to just below boiling, using gasoline-fired immersion heaters. Then, carefully, systematically, pour the hot water over the engine's cylinder heads, crankcase, and oil sump. The heat would warm the frozen oil, allowing it to flow. It would expand the metal components enough to free binding pistons, and it would raise the engine temperature enough that combustion might be possible. The risks were enormous. Thermal shock could crack cylinder heads. Water entering the ignition system could cause permanent electrical damage. Moisture freezing inside the engine after the attempt could make the problem worse. If this failed, they might render the engines completely unrepairable, even if they somehow got them to a depot. McKinley made the decision. We try it on one vehicle. If it works, we do all 12. If it fails, we still have 11 that might be fixable later. Sullivan selected the M18 with the newest engine, reasoning it would have the fewest pre-existing problems. He organized a team, 4 men heating water in 5-gallon cans, 2 men carefully distributing the heated water across the engine, 1 man standing by with dry towels to immediately wipe away any water that contacted electrical components, and Sullivan himself monitoring the process, adjusting technique based on what he saw. The first attempt was tentative. They poured 2 gallons of hot water slowly across the massive radial engine's cylinder heads. Steam rose in clouds. Metal pinged and creaked as it expanded. Sullivan waited 5 minutes, testing the oil dipstick, still too thick, still resisting flow. They poured another 3 gallons, this time concentrating on the oil sump and crankcase. More waiting, more testing. Sullivan's hands, exposed to the frigid air and hot metal alternately, were red and raw. But he refused gloves. He needed to feel the metal temperature, needed to sense when the engine was ready. After 20 minutes and 15 gallons of heated water, Sullivan nodded to the driver. "Try it." The starter motor engaged. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th revolution, a cylinder fired, then another. The Wright R975 coughed, sputtered, backfired once, and caught. The distinctive roar of the radial engine shattered the pre-dawn silence. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The engine ran rough for perhaps 30 seconds, then smoothed out as oil pressure built and fuel flow stabilized. Sullivan had just solved a problem that Army technical manuals said was unsolvable in field conditions. McKinley immediately ordered the procedure repeated on all 11 remaining vehicles. Sullivan trained the other mechanics in his technique, refining the process with each engine. By 0600 hours, all 12 M18s had running engines. By 0700, they were combat ready. At 0815 on December 23rd, German forces launched their expected attack on Bastonia's northern perimeter. The 340th Volksgrenadier Division, supported by elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, advanced with 18 Panther tanks and approximately 2,000 infantry. They encountered the 12 M18s that German intelligence had reported as disabled. The engagement lasted 42 minutes. The M18s, using their superior mobility and shoot and scoot tactics, destroyed 11 Panthers and 3 Panzer IVs, while suffering only 1 vehicle damaged by return fire. The German attack collapsed. The northern perimeter held. Major Hans Kokott, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and coordinating the attack, wrote in his after-action report, "Enemy tank destroyers previously assessed as non-operational were fully combat effective. Attack failed due to underestimation of enemy maintenance capability and mobility of American forces." What Kokott didn't understand, what no German commander could comprehend, was that the American military had something the Wehrmacht could never replicate. Thousands of farm boys like Danny Sullivan, who had spent their childhoods making machinery work under impossible conditions with inadequate tools and no spare parts. The German military trained excellent mechanics. Their technical schools were rigorous, their maintenance procedures were sophisticated, but German mechanics were trained to follow manuals, to use proper tools, to work in proper facilities. When conditions deviated from doctrine, they struggled. American farm boys had grown up improvising. They had learned mechanical principles by necessity, not from textbooks. They understood engines not as collections of parts to be maintained according to schedule, but as systems to be kept running by any means necessary. This fundamental difference in mindset would prove decisive throughout the war. The contrast between American and German maintenance philosophy was rooted in their different societies. Germany, despite its industrial sophistication, remained fundamentally agrarian through the 1930s. Most German soldiers came from small farms or villages, but German farming was traditional. Tools and techniques passed down through generations. Machinery, where it existed, was simple and locally maintained. American farming had industrialized. By 1940, 67% of American farms had tractors. 78% had trucks. Farmers didn't just use machinery, they maintained it themselves because the nearest dealer might be 50 miles away. Farm boys like Danny Sullivan learned mechanical skills because their family's survival depended on keeping equipment running. This created a vast pool of mechanically skilled soldiers that America mobilized for war. When the draft swept through rural America, it brought hundreds of thousands of young men who could diagnose engine problems by sound, who could fabricate replacement parts with basic tools, who could make repairs that formerly trained mechanics said were impossible. The story of Danny Sullivan and the frozen M-18s was not unique. Across every theater of war, American maintenance personnel routinely achieved what doctrine said was impossible. Their success stemmed from three factors: practical experience with machinery, willingness to improvise, and a culture that rewarded problem-solving over procedure following. Consider the contrast in maintenance statistics. By December 1944, the U.S. Army in Europe maintained operational readiness rates of 78% for tanks, 82% for trucks, and 76% for armored vehicles. The Wehrmacht's operational readiness never exceeded 60%, and by late 1944 had dropped to 35%. These weren't just numbers. They represented fundamental differences in maintenance philosophy and capability. American maintenance doctrine emphasized three levels: organizational maintenance, performed by unit mechanics at battalion or company level; direct support maintenance, performed by dedicated maintenance companies at division level; general support maintenance, performed at theater-level depots. This system pushed maintenance capability forward, close to combat units. German maintenance followed a more centralized model. Unit-level mechanics handled only basic tasks. Most repairs required vehicles to be transported to rear-area workshops. Complex repairs went to factory-level facilities. This system worked when Germany was winning and could control secure rear areas. It collapsed when Germany was losing and transportation networks were under constant air attack. The psychological difference was equally important. American maintenance personnel were encouraged to improvise, to find solutions rather than wait for proper parts or procedures. German mechanics were trained to follow technical manuals precisely. Deviation from approved procedures could result in disciplinary action. This created a self-perpetuating cycle. American mechanics gained confidence through successful improvisation, making them more willing to attempt difficult repairs. German mechanics, restricted by doctrine, became less confident in their ability to solve unusual problems. Before we continue with more incredible stories of American ingenuity, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the untold stories of World War II, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. These stories of ordinary soldiers achieving extraordinary things need to be remembered and shared. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these forgotten heroes to light. The advantages of American farm boy mechanics extended beyond individual ingenuity to systematic innovation. When American soldiers identified a recurring problem, they developed solutions that were quickly shared across units. The Army published technical bulletins incorporating field modifications. Successful improvisations became standard procedures. German forces, by contrast, struggled to share innovations. Their more rigid command structure meant field modifications required formal approval. By the time a solution was evaluated, approved, and disseminated, the tactical situation had changed. The Jeep exemplified this difference. The quarter-ton 4x4 vehicle was designed for simplicity and field maintainability. Its four-cylinder engine could be completely disassembled with basic tools. Parts were standardized and interchangeable. Maintenance manuals were written in plain language that high school graduates could understand. American mechanics routinely performed repairs that the official manual classified as depot-level maintenance. They rebuilt engines in field conditions. They fabricated replacement parts using scrap metal. They kept Jeeps running through maintenance cycles that should have required factory overhaul. Private Harold Chen, a mechanic with the 1st Infantry Division, once kept a Jeep operational for 14 months and over 20,000 miles without it ever seeing a maintenance depot. He replaced the engine twice, the transmission once, and fabricated over 30 custom parts, all using tools that fit in a standard mechanic's toolbox. German equivalent vehicles, the Kubelwagen and Schwimmwagen, were better engineered in many respects. More sophisticated suspension, better all-terrain capability. But they were harder to maintain. Repairs required specialized tools. Parts were less interchangeable. Maintenance manuals assumed access to proper facilities. The result? American Jeeps maintained higher operational readiness rates despite often receiving harder use and less regular service. The tank destroyer battalions exemplified American maintenance advantages. These units operated independently, often detached from parent divisions, sometimes fighting 30 to 50 miles from supply lines. They couldn't rely on division maintenance companies. They had to solve their own problems. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, Danny Sullivan's unit, maintained operational readiness rates averaging 74% throughout the Ardennes campaign, despite extreme cold, constant combat, and supply shortages. Their German opponents, the 2nd Panzer Division, never achieved operational readiness above 42% during the same period. This disparity stemmed from American maintenance philosophy. The 705th had dedicated maintenance personnel at every level. Company mechanics handled routine service. Battalion Maintenance Platoon handled complex repairs, but critically, every crew member received basic mechanical training. Drivers could perform field expedient repairs. Gunners understood the vehicle's mechanical systems. Commanders knew enough to make informed decisions about what was fixable and what wasn't. German panzer crews, by contrast, often knew little about their vehicle's mechanical operation. They were trained to fight, not to maintain. When mechanical problems occurred, they waited for recovery vehicles and repair units. This worked in garrison. It failed in combat. The difference showed starkly during the Ardennes offensive. German vehicles that broke down were often abandoned. Recovery vehicles couldn't reach them due to Allied air superiority and artillery interdiction. Repair units couldn't bring them forward. Operational German tanks decreased daily, not just from combat losses, but from maintenance failures. American vehicles that broke down were usually recovered and repaired. Unit mechanics would reach disabled vehicles, often under fire, assess problems, and either repair them on site or recover them for repair behind friendly lines. The American military's entire logistics system was designed around this recovery and repair philosophy. Statistics tell the story. During the Battle of the Bulge, German forces abandoned approximately 350 armored vehicles due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel. American forces abandoned 42. This 10-to-1 advantage in recovery and repair capability represented more than just better logistics. It represented a fundamental cultural advantage. Consider a specific example from January 1945. On January 3rd, a platoon of M10 tank destroyers from the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion was conducting reconnaissance near Longvilly when they encountered a German roadblock. In the firefight, 2 M10s were hit by anti-tank fire, not penetrated, but damaged enough to disable their engines and transmissions. The platoon withdrew, leaving the 2 vehicles behind under covering fire. According to doctrine, these were combat losses. The vehicles would be recovered later if possible, sent to depot for major repairs, and might return to service in months. But Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien, the platoon sergeant, had other ideas. That night, he led a recovery team back to the disabled vehicles. Working in darkness under threat of German patrols, His mechanics assessed the damage. Both vehicles had repairable damage, but repairs would normally require depot facilities. O'Brien's team improvised. Using parts cannibalized from a destroyed German half-track, scrap metal from a damaged barn, and tools that fit in 2 toolboxes, they repaired both engines and one transmission. The second transmission was beyond field repair, but they rigged a tow bar from fence posts and cable. By dawn, both vehicles were back in American lines. By noon on January 4th, both were combat-ready again. German forces, monitoring American radio traffic, reported that new tank destroyers had reinforced the sector. They didn't understand that the Americans had simply refused to abandon repairable vehicles. This pattern repeated across the entire European theater. American units routinely recovered and repaired vehicles that other armies would have written off. The combination of skilled mechanics, adequate tools, available parts, and cultural emphasis on keeping equipment running created operational advantages that multiplied American numerical superiority. The fuel situation during the Bulge illustrated another dimension of American maintenance superiority. When German forces captured American fuel dumps, they discovered not just vast quantities of gasoline, but complete maintenance supply systems, spare parts organized by vehicle type, tools standardized across units, lubricants and fluids in abundance, technical manuals at every level. German logistics, by contrast, was chaos. Parts were non-standardized. The Wehrmacht operated over 2,000 different vehicle types, each with unique maintenance requirements. Tools were scarce and often incompatible across units. Lubricants were in short supply. Technical information was centralized rather than distributed. This meant American vehicles were easier to maintain even when supply lines were stretched. German vehicles became harder to maintain even in rear areas with good supply access. The human factor was equally important. American maintenance personnel were treated as skilled professionals. They received relatively good pay for enlisted personnel. They had status within their units. Their work was valued and recognized. This attracted quality personnel to maintenance specialties. German maintenance personnel were often older reservists or men deemed unfit for combat duty. Maintenance was seen as secondary to combat. Status was low. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy where less capable personnel entered maintenance, leading to worse maintenance outcomes, leading to lower status for maintenance, leading to even less capable personnel entering the field. American forces also emphasized maintenance training at every level. Basic training included mechanical fundamentals. Unit training included maintenance tasks. Specialized schools produced skilled technicians. But equally important, the culture encouraged learning and skill development. Danny Sullivan's path typified this. He entered the Army with mechanical aptitude from farm experience, but no formal training. The Army recognized his talent and sent him to Tank Destroyer Mechanic School. There, he received formal instruction that built on his practical knowledge. After graduating, he continued learning through experience and from other mechanics. The Army encouraged this continuous improvement. German mechanics received excellent initial training, but limited continuing education. Once trained, they were expected to maintain existing skills but rarely gained new ones. This became critical as technology evolved during the war. American mechanics adapted to new vehicles and weapon systems. German mechanics struggled. By 1945, the maintenance gap had become unbridgeable. American forces operated the most sophisticated military vehicles in the world: M26 Pershing tanks, M24 Chaffee light tanks, improved M4 Shermans with high-velocity guns, and maintained them in field conditions. German forces couldn't keep their simpler, older vehicles operational, despite having factories and depots within Germany itself. The story of Danny Sullivan and the frozen engines was dramatic, because it happened at a critical moment in a famous battle. But the real significance was that it wasn't unique. Thousands of American mechanics were doing similar things every day across every theater. They were solving problems that doctrine said were unsolvable. They were keeping equipment running under impossible conditions. They were turning American industrial output into battlefield effectiveness. Consider the statistics more carefully. America produced approximately 2.6 million military trucks during the war. Germany produced approximately 350,000. But American operational readiness rates were twice as high. This meant America effectively had a 12-to-1 advantage in truck availability, not the 8-to-1 advantage that production numbers suggested. For tanks, America produced approximately 88,000 medium and heavy tanks. Germany produced approximately 47,000. But American tanks spent more time operational. This effectively gave America not a 2-to-1 advantage, but closer to 3-to-1 in available armor. This multiplication of industrial advantage through maintenance superiority was one of the decisive factors in Allied victory. Raw production numbers were impressive, but the ability to keep that production operational in field conditions was what actually won battles. German commanders understood this too late. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, captured in May 1945, told interrogators, "Your production was overwhelming, but what really defeated us was that your equipment kept working. Our tanks would break down and stay broken. Yours would break down and be back in action the next day. We couldn't match that." General Heinz Guderian, father of German armored doctrine, was even more explicit in post-war writings. "We focused on building the best tanks. You focused on building tanks that would keep running. In prolonged war, you were proven correct." The maintenance advantage extended beyond just keeping equipment running. It shaped tactics and strategy. American commanders could plan operations assuming high readiness rates. They could push tempo knowing their vehicles would keep pace. They could operate at extended distances from supply bases because their maintenance personnel could keep units operational. German commanders had to plan around maintenance limitations. Operations were constrained by readiness rates. Tempo was limited by how far vehicles could travel before breaking down. Distance from supply bases became critical because disabled vehicles couldn't be recovered or repaired. This created a vicious cycle. American mobility increased through effective maintenance. German mobility decreased through ineffective maintenance. American tempo increased. German tempo decreased. American operational reach extended. German operational reach contracted. Each small advantage compounded into larger advantages. The individual skill of mechanics like Danny Sullivan was multiplied by systems that supported and enabled their work. The Army's technical bulletin system meant successful field expedient repairs were documented and shared. The supply system ensured parts were available when needed. The training system continuously produced new skilled mechanics. The recovery system meant disabled vehicles could be brought to mechanics. The entire military machine was optimized around keeping equipment operational. Germany had skilled mechanics, but lacked the supporting systems. Field expedient repairs weren't systematically shared. Parts were chronically unavailable. Training production decreased as the war progressed. Recovery capabilities were limited. The military machine fought against maintenance rather than supporting it. The cold morning of December 23, 1944, when Danny Sullivan poured hot water on frozen engines, represented more than one farm boy's ingenuity. It represented the culmination of American industrial society's evolution, a society that had mechanized its agriculture, that valued practical problem-solving, that rewarded innovation over procedure, that distributed knowledge widely rather than concentrating it, that empowered individuals to make decisions rather than requiring approval, that recognized and utilized talent wherever it appeared. The Wehrmacht was an excellent military machine by most measures. Professional officer corps, rigorous training, combat-proven tactics. But it was built on a society that hadn't fully industrialized, that valued hierarchy over initiative, that concentrated knowledge rather than distributing it, that required approval rather than empowering decision-making, that often wasted talent through rigid social structures. These societal differences expressed themselves in countless ways. Maintenance was just one, but it was one with decisive battlefield impact. By the time the Ardennes campaign ended in late January 1945, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed 83 German armored vehicles, while losing only 7 M18s to enemy action. Their operational readiness rate never fell below 68%, despite continuous combat in extreme weather. German units they faced never achieved readiness above 45% during the same period. This 3-to-1 advantage in combat effectiveness stemmed from many factors: better training, better equipment, better tactics. But underlying all of it was better maintenance, the ability to keep fighting vehicles operational under the worst conditions, the ability to repair battle damage quickly, the ability to keep moving when the enemy was stopped. Danny Sullivan's hot water engine treatment became unofficial doctrine in the 705th. Other tank destroyer battalions heard about it and adopted similar procedures. By February 1945, it was standard practice across multiple units. The Army eventually published a technical bulletin documenting the technique, though characteristically, Americans gave it a more professional-sounding name: Thermal Conditioning Procedure for Cold-Soaked Radial Engines, but soldiers still called it the Sullivan Start. And farm boys across the Army smiled, knowing that what their officers were now calling thermal conditioning was what they had been doing to tractors back home for years. Sullivan survived the war and returned to Nebraska. He married his high school sweetheart, bought a farm, and spent 40 years raising corn and soybeans. He rarely spoke about his military service. When people in town learned he'd received the Bronze Star for his actions at Bastogne, he shrugged it off. "Just did what needed doing," he would say. "Same as fixing a tractor. You figure out what's wrong, and you make it right." That simple philosophy, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of American farm boys in uniform, helped win a war. The Wehrmacht had to contend not just with American industrial production, but with an army of soldiers who understood machinery instinctively, who refused to accept that problems were unsolvable, who had grown up making broken things work. German military professionals faced American amateurs who somehow weren't amateur at all. They'd been training their entire lives without knowing it. Every frozen tractor they'd coaxed back to life, every harvest they'd brought in with failing equipment, every winter they'd survived with improvised repairs, all of it prepared them for war. Staff Sergeant McKinley, Sullivan's sergeant at Bastogne, put it best in a letter home to his wife, dated Christmas Day 1944. "We've got kids in this battalion who can fix anything. Half of them barely finished 8th grade, but they understand machinery in ways that college-educated engineers don't. Give them a wrench and a problem, and they'll find a solution. The Germans have no answer to that. They can build better tanks, but we've got better mechanics, and in a long war, that's what matters." McKinley was right. In the final analysis, the Pacific and European theaters were won not by superior generals or better tactics or overwhelming firepower, though America had all of those. They were won by supply sergeants who kept units equipped, by truck drivers who kept supplies moving, by mechanics who kept vehicles running, and by farm boys who knew how to make broken things work. The Battle of Bastogne stands in history as a triumph of American courage and determination. The 101st Airborne's defense, Patton's relief column, McAuliffe's famous nuts reply. These are the stories we remember. But behind those dramatic moments were thousands of smaller victories that made them possible. Tank destroyers that should have been deadlined but kept fighting, trucks that should have broken down but kept rolling, jeeps that should have frozen solid but kept running, equipment that worked because mechanics like Danny Sullivan refused to let it fail. Before we conclude this remarkable story, I want to ask you again to subscribe to our channel. These are the forgotten stories of World War II, the ordinary soldiers who did extraordinary things without recognition or glory. Your subscription helps preserve their memory and shares their legacy with new generations. Please hit that subscribe button and notification bell now. The lesson of December 23rd, 1944 extends far beyond that specific battle. It teaches that military capability isn't just about production or technology or training, though all matter. It's about culture, about societies that encourage problem solving, about systems that empower individuals, about recognizing that talent appears in unexpected places and must be utilized wherever it's found. Danny Sullivan, farm boy from Nebraska who never finished high school, saved 12 tank destroyers and helped hold Bastonia. Not through heroic sacrifice or tactical genius, through practical mechanical skill developed fixing tractors in his father's barn. He was one soldier among 16 million Americans who served. But his story represents millions of similar stories. Ordinary people who brought extraordinary capabilities to war. Citizens who became soldiers but never stopped being citizens, bringing civilian skills and civilian initiative to military problems. The Wehrmacht couldn't match that. They could produce professional soldiers. They couldn't produce citizen soldiers who brought entire civilian skill sets to military service. They could train excellent mechanics. They couldn't replicate the practical experience of farm boys who'd spent childhoods keeping machinery running. They could build sophisticated equipment. They couldn't match the ability of American forces to keep that equipment operational under impossible conditions. In the end, that made all the difference. The Third Reich fell not just to American firepower, but to American ingenuity. Not just to industrial production, but to mechanical improvisation. Not just to military training, but to civilian skills, applied to military problems. One farm boy with a bucket of hot water and an understanding of thermal expansion changed a battle. Thousands of farm boys with similar skills changed a war. Millions of American citizens brought similar practical capabilities to the largest military mobilization in history. That was America's secret weapon. Not the atomic bomb, not radar, not any specific technology. It was the practical capability of ordinary citizens who became extraordinary soldiers. The Wehrmacht never understood it. The Third Reich never countered it. By the time German commanders recognized what they were facing, it was too late. The frozen morning of December 23, 1944, when Danny Sullivan proved that farm boy common sense could solve problems that stumped military professionals, stands as symbol of why America won World War II. The answer wasn't in Washington's planning or Detroit's factories, though both mattered. The answer was in thousands of small towns across America, in barns and workshops, on farms and in garages, where young men learned to make things work, where practical skills were valued, where problems were meant to be solved, not accepted. Those young men went to war. They took their skills with them. They applied farm boy common sense to military problems. They fixed what doctrine said was unfixable. They achieved what regulation said was impossible. They won battles that strategy said were unwinnable. One of them, on one frozen morning, kept 12 tank destroyers running when they should have been dead. That changed one battle. The same story, repeated millions of times across 6 years of war, changed the world. Danny Sullivan went home to his farm. The war became memory. The lessons were forgotten by many. But they shouldn't be, because they teach eternal truths about capability and culture, about the power of practical knowledge, about the value of citizens who bring diverse skills to common purpose, about societies that empower rather than control, that distribute knowledge rather than concentrate it, that reward initiative rather than punish deviation. These lessons matter today as much as they did in 1944. The specifics change, the principles don't. Free societies that educate broadly, that value practical knowledge, that empower problem solving, that utilize talent wherever it appears, that encourage initiative. These societies possess advantages that authoritarian systems can never match. Danny Sullivan, with his bucket of hot water, proved that on a frozen morning in Belgium. His proof still echoes through history, still teaches us today, still reminds us why free people, given the tools and the opportunity and the trust, can achieve the impossible. The frozen M18s roared to life. The northern perimeter held. Bastonia didn't fall. The Bulge became Germany's last offensive. The war moved toward its inevitable conclusion, all because a farm boy from Nebraska knew how to fix an engine. That's not just a war story. That's the story of America itself.